The dawn did not break over the bleached flats. It leaked. A thin, cold stain of exhausted wine seeped across the salt pan, finding the edges of alkali and cracked earth. The light held no promise. It was just an illumination of misery. Rowan Decker felt the cold bite of the steel in his hands more than the air. The bolt cutters were heavy, an ugly, modern tool for an ancient problem. He worked with a grim economy of movement, setting the jaws against the final link of the chain that bound the woman to the iron stake. The stake itself was an old cavalry picket, driven deep. He put his weight into the handles. There was a dull, metallic snap. The sound was shockingly final. The severed link sprang apart, and the length of heavy, rust-caked chain slithered from the stake and fell into the dust with the sound of a dead snake. The woman did not move, not at first. She remained standing, as she must have been standing, or collapsed against the chain, for God knew how long. The air was so cold it felt like wet canvas on the skin, but she was rigid. Rowan stepped back, dropping the cutters. He pushed his hat back an inch. The gray light caught the planes of his face, showing a map of exhaustion and something else, a grim satisfaction. The job was done. Then she rose, not like a victim, not with the shuddering relief of the saved. She rose like a column of smoke. Straight up, her eyes, which had been fixed on the horizon, swiveled and locked onto his. She was Apache, Dasba Nantan. Though Rowan did not know her name, he knew her people. He knew the look. Her eyes were not dark. They were voids, obsidian. They held the flat, deadly emptiness of a place that has seen too much heat and pressure. She lifted her hands, still manacled at the wrists by a shorter length of chain. The skin beneath was rubbed raw, black with caked blood and dirt. She looked at the broken link on the ground, then back at him. Her voice was not a voice. It was the sound of dry rocks scraping together, a rasp that ripped the silence. "I'd rather die than be yours." Rowan Decker froze. The words struck him harder than a bullet. He felt the air leave his lungs, punched out by the sheer, unadulterated venom in her statement. He had expected fear. He had expected tears. He realized with a sickening lurch of self-loathing, expected gratitude. He had tracked the three slavers for 40 miles, ever since he cut their sign near the San Pedro crossing. He'd seen the tracks of a fourth person, dragged, not walking. He knew what they were. Moxley, Vreek, and Quintero. Their names were spat out like bad tobacco in settlements from here to the border. He had ridden hard, fueled by a righteousness that now felt like ash in his mouth. He had seen the campfires, dismounted a mile out, and crept in, rifle first, ready for a war. He found the camp abandoned, save for her, chained to the stake like an animal. The three men gone. He had approached her slowly, hands up, showing her the cutters. He had seen the terror in her eyes then, a wild, trapped animal panic that made him sick. He had spoken low, the same way he'd gentle a spooked horse. "I'm here to help." He had cut the chain. He had performed the rescue. And his mistake, he saw it now, was not the act itself. The mistake was in the assumption, the arrogance. He had moved like a man setting a bird free, believing he was the one granting the freedom. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a person who had never, not for 1 second, been unfree. She had been captive. Yes, but her mind, her will, was a fortress he could not even approach. His cutting the chain was not a gift. It was merely the removal of a temporary, physical inconvenience. His presence, his assumptions. He was the new chain. He was the white man who assumed his intervention was salvation. "I'd rather die than be yours." She was right. In that moment, he owned her. He had, by his act, laid claim to her survival. "I don't," Rowan started, his voice thick. He cleared his throat. "I don't want you. I'm not—" He trailed off. How did he explain, against the evidence of his own actions, that he was not the same as them she spat? A small, dry fleck of dust and contempt that landed near his boot. Rowan took an involuntary step back. The temperature of the entire desert seemed to drop. The silence stretched, brittle and thin. He broke his gaze from hers and forced himself to scan the camp. The reality of her situation, of their situation, settled back in. The place was a wreck, not a fight, but a hurried departure. The fire was a circle of stones and lukewarm ash. A blackened cooking pot was kicked onto its side. 3 canvas saddlebags were ripped open, their contents flour, dried beans. Jerky spilled onto the alkali flat. They had taken what they could carry and fled. He saw the tracks. The panicked, heavy boot prints heading west, toward the breaks. The horses had been taken, all save his own, tied a quarter-mile back in a dry wash. Why the panic? He had come in silent. He looked back at the woman. Her buckskin tunic was torn at the shoulder, and on her left side, just below the ribs, was a dark, wet stain. It was not the caked black of her wrists and ankles. This was fresh, a deep, steady seep, a slice. She had fought them. That was it. She had fought them, and they had fled. Maybe they heard him coming, or maybe she had finally done enough damage to make them run. The gash in her side was the price. Rowan felt the last of his imagined nobility evaporate, replaced by a cold, practical dread. That wound was bad. In this heat, with this filth, it was a death sentence. He unslung his canteen. The water sloshed, loud in the stillness. He pulled the cork. Water, he said. It was not a question. It was a command, softened by habit. Her eyes narrowed to slits. She looked at the canteen, then back at his face. The muscles in her jaw tightened. "Want and need are different," she hissed. She would not take it from his hand. To accept it was to accept his power, his provision. She would die of thirst before she gave him that. Rowan understood. He held her gaze for a long second, then bent down. He placed the canteen on the cracked earth, 3 feet from where the chain had ended. He slid it toward her. It scraped the ground. She watched it, but did not move. She turned her back to him. It was the most profound dismissal he had ever experienced. It was as if he had ceased to exist. She looked north, toward the looming red rock escarpment that walled off the flats. A narrow, jagged fissure split the rock face. A brutal climb that looked impossible for anything but a goat or a lizard. Coyote's ladder. It was the only way up to the high mesa, the only way out. She took a step. Her whole body registered the movement. A tremor of agony shot up from her raw ankles. She kept her left arm pressed tight to her side, trying to hold the gash together with sheer will. She took another step. Rowan stood by the dead fire, a ghost in his own story. He was irrelevant. He watched her walk. Each step was a calculation of pain against purpose. She did not limp. She absorbed the pain, refusing to give it the satisfaction of showing. She was moving toward the rocks, toward that impossible climb. He could leave. He could mount his horse, ride south, and be in San Miguel by nightfall. He could report the slavers. He could wash his hands of this. He looked at the small, upright figure moving with defiant agony toward the cliffs. He looked at the blood patch widening on her side. He looked at the chaotic tracks of the 3 men. Heading west. They were still out there. They might come back for their spilled supplies. Or they might be circling, waiting. He let out a long, slow breath. He walked to his horse, the sound of his own boots too loud. He pulled the bolt cutters from his belt and shoved them deep into his saddlebag, burying the ugly tool under his spare ammunition. He did not put the canteen away. He swung into the saddle. The leather creaked. The woman heard it. Her back stiffened, but she did not stop walking. She did not look back. Rowan reined his horse, letting the animal pick its way through the scattered camp gear. He did not move toward her. He moved parallel. He kept his distance, a precise, measured 30 paces. It was not the distance of a pursuer, nor that of a protector. It was the distance of someone going in the same direction, for reasons of his own. He watched the patch of red rock she was aiming for. He watched the western horizon, where 3 men had vanished into the glare. He watched the dust his own horse kicked up, and the small, determined figure walking ahead of him. The rescue was over. This was something else entirely. The sun climbed, and it found its teeth, By the time they cleared the shallow depression of Dry Bone Wash, the light had ceased to be a stain and had become a physical weight. It was a brass hammer striking the anvil of the earth, and they were the sparks caught in between. The air grew thick, shimmering in waves that made the distant line of mesquite narrows twist like a snake. There was no shade, not the memory of a tree, not the promise of a cloud. The rocks themselves seemed to sweat heat, radiating a dry, baking offense that rose from the ground as the sun assaulted from above. Rowan kept his horse to a slow, plodding walk, the animal's head low. The 30-pace gap held. He had wrapped his kerchief over his nose and mouth, but the cloth felt like hot wool, and the air he breathed was scoured. Ahead of him, Dasba walked. Her pace was a miracle of metronomic stubbornness. She did not slow. She did not look back. She simply moved, her feet finding purchase on the gravel and alkali, one in front of the other. But the sun was a hunter, and it was finding its mark. Rowan watched her left shoulder. It had begun to hitch, a small, repetitive knot pulling tight under the torn buckskin. She was trying to favor the gash in her side, and the effort was costing her. The agony of her ankles, rubbed raw by the irons, was a thing he could only guess at. He could see it in the way she placed her feet, too carefully, as if walking on broken glass. But it was the sweat that he watched. For the first hour, it had run freely, plastering the dark hair to her scalp, leaving damp patches on her back. Now, it was stopping. It was the most dangerous sign in the desert. Worse than a canteen running dry. Worse than a rattlesnake's warning. The body, pushed past its limit, was hoarding its moisture. Her skin, he could see even from this distance, was taking on a tight, dry sheen. The salt from her earlier sweat was a white crust on her temples. She was walking on will. The will was about to break. Rowan pulled the cork from his canteen again. He did not let the horse stop. He let the animal move forward another 10 paces, closing the gap. Water. His voice was a dry croak. The word vanished in the vast, humming silence. She did not turn. Her pace did not alter. She might not have heard, or, more likely, she had heard and dismissed it. He would not call again. He would not beg her to live. He nudged his horse slightly to the left, angling. He measured the arc, the weight of the half-full canteen, the speed of her walk. He lifted his arm. It was a smooth, underhand toss. The canteen spun slowly, end over end, a dark shape against the blinding sky. It followed a perfect, silent trajectory, calculated to land not at her feet, but to cross her path, shoulder high. Her left hand snapped out. She did not look at it. She did not break stride. Her hand simply appeared in the air, intercepted the strap, and closed. It was a reflex as pure as a blink. She caught it. Rowan reined his horse to a stop. Dasba kept walking for another 5, 6 steps, the canteen swinging from her grip. Then she, too, stopped. Her back was still to him. She stood for a long moment, the heat rising from the ground around her. She lifted the canteen. She did not unscrew the cap. She ripped the cork out with her teeth and spat it onto the ground. She raised the canteen high and tilted her head back. The way she drank was an act of violence. It was not a sip. It was a drowning. She poured the water into her mouth, her throat working convulsively. She gulped it down with a raw, desperate sound that carried across the 30 feet of shimmering air. Water spilled from the corners of her mouth. It ran in clean, startling tracks down the column of her throat, washing away the dust and grime. It disappeared into the torn neckline of her buckskin tunic. She drank until the canteen was empty, then held it upside down for another second, shaking it to get the last drop. Rowan watched, and his chest grew tight. His own throat ached in sympathy. But it was more than that. It was the savage, unadorned beauty of it. It was the raw need of life, the absolute refusal to surrender. It was the most honest thing he had seen in a year. In that moment, she was not a victim, not an Apache, not a woman. She was survival itself, in its most brutal and beautiful form. She lowered the canteen, breathing hard, almost gasping. She did not turn around. Rowan dismounted. His own legs felt stiff. He walked his horse closer, stopping 10 feet behind her. He nodded toward her left side. The sun baked the damp patch, but he could see the stain beneath it. It was wider. The edges were no longer just damp. They were stiff. The buckskin blackened and glued to her skin. "It will fester," he said, his voice quiet. She turned her head, just enough to fix him with one eye. "I have bled before. Not like that. In this heat, the poison will set in by nightfall." She faced forward again, her shoulders rigid. "Then it will rot." She tossed the canteen. It was a sharp, overhand throw, aimed not at him, but at his feet. It landed in the dust with a hollow thud. She started walking again. Rowan picked up the canteen, corked it, and looped it over his saddle horn. He mounted. The leather of the saddle was hot enough to burn. They moved on. The mesquite narrows were still a hazy promise on the horizon. The wind picked up. It was not a relief. It was the desert's breath, a blast from a furnace door. It lifted the fine, stinging sand from the flats, whipping it into low, smoking plumes. The world shrank to a grit-filled haze. The sun was a white disk behind the dust. The silence was absolute, save for two sounds. There was the frantic thrum of a hummingbird, a tiny, iridescent jewel of impossible energy, hovering by a cluster of pale, blooming cholla. It was a flicker of life so intense it seemed like a hallucination. And then there was the scrape. Rowan saw it. When the terrain shifted from hardpan to a patch of soft, ankle-deep sand, her pace faltered. For a moment, her body betrayed her. She staggered. Instantly, her right hand went to her belt. She drew a knife. It was not a steel blade. It was bone, long and pale, sharpened to a lethal point. She gripped the hilt and, when she thought he was looking away, blinded by the dust, she plunged the point into the ground. She used it as a cane, just for a second, a quick prop to steady herself, to push off, to find her balance. The moment her boot found solid ground again, the knife vanished, slipped back into the rawhide sheath at her hip. She did it 3 more times over the next mile. Each time, it was a secret. A moment of weakness she refused to acknowledge. Hidden from the man who followed, she would accept his water, thrown from a distance, because her body demanded it. But she would not show him that she was falling. Rowan pretended to watch the western ridge, his eyes scanning for the tracks of the 3 slavers. But he saw every movement. He saw the scrape of the knife. He saw the pride that was holding her together. And he saw the dark stain on her side, no longer spreading, but baking dry. The rot was already beginning. The sun reached its zenith. It was no longer a fire in the sky. It was the sky itself. The world was bleached to 2 elements, white-hot rock and blinding blue emptiness. The heat was a high, thin ringing sound in Rowan's ears. Dasba's pace had slowed to a torturous crawl. The bone knife was a permanent fixture in her right hand, used not just as a cane, but as a brace, a third leg that kept her upright. She was listing hard to her left, her body finally seizing up around the gash in her side. Ahead, the mesquite narrows finally gave way to the first of the canyon's catclaw notch. It was not a canyon. It was a wound in the earth, a vertical slash in the sandstone, barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. It promised one thing the open flats did not shadow. Dasba veered toward it, her focus absolute. She did not look at Rowan. She did not pause. She reached the narrow opening and, turning her good shoulder, slipped into the darkness and was gone. Rowan stopped at the mouth of the fissure. He looped his horse's reins around a dead, sun-scorched scrub branch. The animal lowered its head, flanks heaving. Rowan stood in the full, punishing blaze of the sun. He could feel the skin on the back of his neck crackling. He looked into the fissure. It was deep. It smelled of cold stone and ancient dust. He was a white man. She was an Apache woman. He had cut her chains. He was following her. To enter that tight, dark space with her was a violation. It was an intrusion. The rules of decency, the rules of distance, demanded he wait outside. He would find his own shade, or he would endure the sun. He stood there, the sweat stinging his eyes. His hat a useless circle of hot felt. He was baking. His brain felt slow, cooked inside his skull. A voice, dry and hollow, echoed from the cool darkness. "Courtesy will get you sunstroke." He turned his head, looking into the black slit. He could see nothing. "Sit." The word was not an invitation. It was a command, clipped and practical. It was the same tone a man might use on a dog, but it held something else, a weary acknowledgement that his dying out there in the light did her no good. He pulled his kerchief off, wiping his face. He nodded to the empty darkness. He inhaled the hot air and, turning sideways, squeezed his shoulders through the opening. The change was instantaneous and absolute. The temperature plunged by 20, maybe 30 degrees. The blinding white light was cut off, replaced by a cool, deep twilight. The ringing in his ears stopped, but the world had shrunk to the space of a coffin. He slid his back along the rough sandstone wall, his boots sinking into fine, soft sand. He edged deeper into the gloom until the sliver of daylight from the entrance was just a bright scar. He let his legs fold, sliding down the wall until he was seated. He was not alone. He heard her breathe, a slow, shallow intake of air, followed by a long, controlled exhale. He squinted, his eyes adjusting. She was opposite him, but the fissure was barely 4 feet wide. Her knees were drawn up, and his were, too. Their boots were almost touching. She was a deeper shadow against the shadow. He tried to shift, to give her more space. His left shoulder brushed her right. A jolt went through him. It was not a spark. It was just contact. The buckskin of her tunic was stiff, caked with dirt. But beneath it, her body was radiating a dry, furious heat. He pulled his shoulder back, pressing himself into the unyielding rock. The silence was a thick, heavy blanket. In the stillness, every small sensation was magnified. He could hear the faint scrape of her fingernail against the rock wall. He could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. And he could smell her. It was not the scent of a woman. It was the primal scent of a human being pushed to the last edge of endurance. It was the sharp, metallic tang of drying blood, the acrid bite of old sweat, the dust of the flats, and the faint, warm smell of the leather she wore. It was the smell of life, and it was so potent it made his heart stumble. He took a breath, and the air was full of her. He had to break the silence. His own voice sounded wrong. An intrusion. The men, the ones who chained you. She did not move. He saw the faint outline of her head, facing the darkness. Not him. 3 traitors. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. A simple reporting of facts. Judd Moxley, Tomer Vreek, Pardo Quintero. Rowan knew the names. Moxley was a bull, a former hide hunter known for his temper and his heavy fists. Vreek was a whisper, a small man who dealt in rumors and supplies for men who operated outside the law. Quintero, he only knew by reputation, a half-Comanche tracker who was faster with a knife than any man had a right to be. They ran in the night, Rowan said, thinking of the abandoned camp. They must have heard me coming. She turned her head. He could not see her eyes, but he felt them. He felt the weight of her stare in the dark. They are not finished with me. It was not a prediction of capture. It was a statement of intent. Her intent. She had survived. She would hunt. He finally understood. The gash in her side was not a wound of capture. It was a wound of battle. She had fought them. She had made them run. The realization settled on him, heavy as the rock at his back. He had been so proud of his bolt cutters, of his righteous rescue. He looked at the shape of her, and his pride felt cheap. "I told you," he said, his voice dropping, forcing the words out. "I do not want to own you." He saw her shift. She leaned forward, just an inch. The faint light from the entrance caught the sharp line of her jaw. "You do not have to," she whispered, and the whisper was more dangerous than her shout had been. "Your kindness does." Rowan frowned. "Kindness. All kindness is a type of chain." Her voice was sharp, a piece of chipped flint. "It demands thanks. It demands debt. It demands I be the one who was saved, and you be the one who did the saving." She leaned closer. He could feel the warmth of her breath. inches from his face. I will not wear that chain. This was the sword fight. She had parried his defense and run him through. He had no response. She was right. He had followed her, holding his canteen and his horse like a debt she had to repay. He had been waiting for her to break, to need him, so his act of rescue would be validated. The space between them was no longer 4 feet. It was 0. The air was charged, suffocating. He turned his head, and now he could see her. The dim light caught the moisture in her eyes. They were fixed on his, a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, a hand hooked in his throat. He could not look away. He could not speak. The silence pressed in. It was no longer a blanket. It was a physical force, the weight of the mountain, pushing them together. It was the silence of the sun-baked world outside, a silence of judgment. Rowan felt a drop of sweat roll from his hairline down his temple. He did not wipe it. She held his gaze for another 10 heartbeats. He watched her. She was a warrior. She was dying. And she was, in this dark, tight space, more free than he had ever been. She was the one who broke the stare. She leaned back against the rock, the tension snapping. She let out a long, slow breath. It was not a sigh of weariness. It was a conscious release, a decision. The duel was over. "Wait for the sun to fall," she said. Her voice was just a voice now, tired, dry. "Then we go." He turned the word over. "We," it was not, "I go." It was not, "You must leave." "We." The word dropped into the profound silence of the notch like a small stone falling into a deep, black well. It was not friendship. It was not trust. It was not a surrender. It was an armistice, a simple, practical acknowledgement of a shared, temporary reality. For now, they were 2 people in a crack in the rock, waiting for the world to cool enough to permit life. The silence that followed the word "we" was heavier than the stone walls. It was the sound of a truce being weighed. In the cool darkness, Rowan could hear the grit shift as Dasba moved her feet, the faint rasp of her breathing, and the hammering of his own pulse in his ears. The air was thick with the scent of her, the blood and the dust, and it was becoming cloying. He could smell the wound. It was the smell of trapped heat, of tissue beginning to turn. He had set men's bones. He had stitched skin on horses and, twice, on men. He knew the speed of poison in the territories. The sun would kill her by noon, but the infection would kill her by midnight, and it would be a harder death. He broke the stillness. His voice was rough. "The gash in your side." He felt her tense across the darkness. She said nothing. "I have water, and a clean cloth. I can clean it." He paused, and the weight of her stare was a physical thing. He added the only words that mattered. Nothing more. He was offering a service, not a rescue. He was a smith offering to shoe a horse, a barber offering a shave. A simple, functional exchange. He was trying to prove her wrong about the chains. He waited. 1 minute, 2. The only sound was the faint, high whistle of the wind over the top of the notch. He saw her shadow move, a slow, single nod of her head. Rowan let out the breath he had been holding. He pushed himself up, his back scraping the wall. "Stay here." He squeezed past her. His thigh brushed her knee. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through his arm. He slid out of the notch, back into the furnace. The light was a physical blow. He staggered, his eyes clenched shut, blinded. He stumbled to his horse, the sun beating on his skull. The animal whinnied, a low, unhappy sound. He fumbled with his saddlebag, his hands clumsy in the glare. He bypassed the jerky and the spare cartridges. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was his spare shirt. It was clean linen, kept for an emergency, for a town visit. This qualified. He tore a long, wide strip from the sleeve. He took his second canteen, the one he kept strapped to the pommel, the one that was full. He soaked the linen strip until it was heavy and dripping. He paused, the water running over his own raw knuckles. He took a long drink himself, then corked it. He returned to the black fissure. Slipping back inside was like plunging his face into a cold spring. The relief was so total it made him dizzy. She had not moved. She was a silhouette against the far wall. "I'm back," he said. his voice quiet. He knelt in the sand, placing the canteen and the wet cloth on the ground. "I cannot see. You will have to move closer to the light, or you will have to turn." She hesitated. To turn her back to him was an act of trust he had not earned. But the alternative was to let him clean it face to face, an intimacy of a different, more confrontational kind. She chose the back. She rose slowly, painfully, and shuffled, her back to the entrance. She stopped, then slid down the wall to sit, facing the deep, absolute dark of the fissure. She presented her left side and her back to him, and to the thin, gray light. Rowan moved, kneeling beside her. Now he could see. The buckskin was stiff with dried blood, gluing the tunic to her skin. The gash was 4 inches long, running vertically along her ribs. It was ugly. It was not just a slice. It was a tear, as if the knife had gone in and been ripped sideways. Quintero's work. The edges were swollen, an angry, puffy red, but the skin just outside the wound was pale and tight. His fingers, thick and calloused from reins and rope, felt clumsy. He reached out, his hands shaking slightly. He touched the buckskin, near the edge of the wound. Her skin was on fire. It was a dry, consuming heat. The heat of a stone left in the sun. The heat of a body burning itself alive. He put his thumb on the leather and his fingers on the bare skin of her back. "This will hurt," he said. It hurts now." He took the wet cloth and squeezed a few drops of water onto the place where the leather was stuck. He let it soak, softening the dried blood. His fingers trembled. He was intensely, painfully aware of the curve of her waist, the line of her spine under his hand. He was a foot soldier. He was a scout. He was not this. He worked the cloth under the edge of the leather, his touch as light as he could make it. He began to peel the buckskin back. She tensed. Her whole body went rigid, a bowstring pulled tight. A sound, half a breath, half a hiss, escaped her teeth. It was pure, animal instinct, the body screaming at the raw touch. Rowan froze. His hand hovered. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a murmur. The sound he used for a horse that was about to bolt. Easy, just to see. He waited. He felt the tension in her back hold. Then, by sheer force of will, she commanded her muscles to relent. It was not a relaxation. It was a controlled surrender to the necessary. He went back to work. He did not pull. He soaked and dabbed and lifted, millimeter by millimeter. The cloth came away red. He rinsed it with more water from the canteen, the clean water turning pink and running into the sand. He dabbed again. The GSH was open now. It was deep. He could see the pale yellow of fascia beneath the muscle. It was inflamed, but it was not yet full of pus. They had time. Maybe. He could see other marks now, fainter, older. A thin, white scar on her shoulder. The imprint of a rope burn on her wrist. Above the raw chafe of the manacles. She had lived a life that made this day just another day. He began to clean the wound itself, wiping away the grit and the caked blood from its edges. He worked with a meticulous focus. "You fought him," he said, his voice flat. He was looking at the tear. He tried to pull the knife back. "And you held on." She said nothing. "Good," Rowan whispered, almost to himself. "Good that you resisted." He looked up, past her shoulder, to the faint outline of her head. He saw her eyes, fixed on the black wall in front of her. But the edges of them, caught in the dim light, were wet. Not tears. A brightness, the softening of a thing that has been held too tight for too long. It was not weakness. It was the shock of being seen. His hand was shaking again, a visible tremor. He tried to steady it, resting his wrist against her ribs. He could feel her heartbeat, a quick, frantic rhythm under his hand. She spoke. Her voice was low, and it vibrated through his fingers. "You tremble." He stopped. "You tremble because you want to touch me." It was not a question. It was a statement, a clinical observation that cut straight through his defenses, through his pretense of being a simple helper. Rowan closed his eyes for a second. The scent of her skin, the blood, the heat, it was overwhelming. He opened them. He looked at his own hand, large and stained, against her copper skin. He breathed. "I tremble," he said, and his voice was thick. "Because I am afraid of hurting you." He set the cloth down. He looked at the wound, angry and open. He looked at the rigid line of her back. A long silence. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Both." The word was a judgment, a truth. It was both. The desire to touch, to know, to hold a thing so alive, and the terrible, profound fear of causing more pain to something that had already known too much. Rowan swallowed. He picked up the cloth. Hold still. He finished the work. He flushed the wound with the last of the clean water. She bore it without flinching, her body now a separate thing from her mind. He tore a thick, clean square from the shirt and folded it into a compress. He placed it over the wound. She hissed. "I have to wrap it," he said. He took the long strip of linen he had torn. He passed it to her. She took the end, holding it against the compress. He leaned around her. He passed the linen strip around her waist. His knuckles brushed the skin of her stomach. It was hot, tight as a drum. He pulled the bandage snug, and he heard her breath catch, a sharp intake of air. He passed it around again, pulling it tight to hold the compress in place. His arm was around her, his hand briefly on her hip to guide the cloth. Each time the linen passed over her skin, he felt the controlled, deepening rhythm of her breath. She was aware of every movement, every brush of his hand, every shift of his weight. She was controlling her response, but she knew. He tied it off at her side, a firm, practical knot. He was finished. He moved back, scraping against the rock wall until he was in his original position. The 4 feet of space between them felt like a mile, and like no space at all. The air in the notch was thick with what had just passed between them. It was a cleansing. It was a violation. It was a necessity. They sat in the new silence. The light at the entrance of the notch was beginning to fade, the brilliant white turning to a softer gold. The worst of the day's heat was over. He was about to say they should rest, that they had hours before the sun was truly down. She spoke first. "Thank you." The words were tiny, brittle, the sound of a dry leaf cracking. He almost did not hear them. It was the first time she had offered him anything, the first crack in the armor. It was a drop of water on a parched, cracked stone. Rowan did not say, "You're welcome." He did not say. It was nothing. He knew what it cost her. He just nodded. They sat. They watched the light die. The gold turned to a deep, angry orange, then to the color of hot iron. The red glow filled the narrow space, painting their faces in the color of blood. When the last of the red faded to a deep, bruised purple, they left the shade. They stepped out onto the cooling flats. The silence was still there, but the sharp, serrated edge was gone. It was just the quiet of the desert at dusk. The night brought the cold. It did not creep in. It fell like an axe, splitting the memory of the day's heat. The desert, which had been an oven, became a block of ice. They made camp in the lee of Salt Wind Ridge, a massive blade of granite that cut the worst of the wind. Rowan built a fire. It was a risk. A fire could be seen for miles, but not to build one was a greater risk. The cold could kill her before the infection did. He used dry mesquite twigs, building a small, hot fire that gave off almost no smoke, a tiny nucleus of warmth in the vast, freezing dark. He offered her jerky. He had 2 pieces. He laid one on the rock near her. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it. She ate with the same fierce, economical movements with torn apart. The distance was no longer a challenge. It was an agreement. He sat on his side of the fire, his blanket wrapped tight. She sat on hers. The 30 paces had shrunk. In the dark, the distance was meaningless. They were 2 people at a fire, a shared pinprick of light. But the invisible line was still there. It had just grown slack, like a rope that had been stretched to its limit and was now, finally, allowed to rest. Hours passed. The stars were chips of ice. The moon was a pale, late sickle, offering no warmth and little light. Rowan watched her. She had not slept. He had not slept. He watched the way she held her left arm, the stiffness in her back. The bandage was a pale strip in the gloom. He pretended to watch the flames, but his every sense was tuned to her. He heard the shift of her weight on the sand. He heard the whisper of her breath. She was gathering herself. She did it without a sound. She did not stand up. She flowed. One moment she was a seated shadow. The next she was a standing one, moving with liquid silence away from the firelight, toward the absolute blackness of the ridge. She was leaving. He was on his feet before his mind had formed the thought. It was not a choice. It was an instinct, a reflex as sharp and involuntary as her catching the canteen. No. The word was a low growl, torn from him. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, the sand muffling his boots. The night air was freezing, but his blood was hot. He reached for her. He grabbed her right arm. The good one. The reaction was instantaneous. She didn't hesitate. She spun, not away from him, but into him, using his own momentum. She was a whirlwind. He felt the air move as her other hand, the hand with the bone knife, came up, aimed for his throat, his eyes. He was ready. He caught her wrist, his fingers closing around the thin, strong bone. The knife was inches from his face. They were locked. It was not a fight. It was a desperate, silent struggle in the dark. It was a grapple of wills. He was stronger, but she was faster. And she was fueled by a lifetime of this. She twisted, her body low, trying to break his grip, to use her legs. He held on, his own body braced. The only sounds were their harsh, gasping breaths, plumes of white in the frigid air, and the scrape of their boots on the gravel. He forced her wrist down, away from his face. She kneed him, a sharp, painful impact on his thigh. He grunted, stumbling back, but he did not let go. He pulled her off balance. She fell. He fell with her, his grip still locked on her arms. They landed hard in the cold sand, him half on top of her. She was a coil of furious energy beneath him, bucking, twisting, feral. He was trying to restrain, not to hurt. He put his weight on her, pinning her shoulders, his hands still clamped on her wrists. "Let go!" The words were spat at him, a spray of hot breath on his frozen face. No. He was breathing just as hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. She arched her back, a violent serpentine movement that almost broke his hold. Why? It was not a question. It was a demand, a snarl. Why him? Why this? He had no answer, not a sane one. He only had the raw, sudden truth that had leaped from his gut. He stared down into her eyes, which were black pits of hatred in the moonlight. "Because if I let you go like this," he gasped, the words ragged, "if I let you walk into that dark, with that wound, knowing what's out there, I become a coward again." The words hung in the absolute stillness. He felt the change. The fury beneath him did not gentle. It did not soften. It just stopped. The energy that had been pushing against him evaporated. She went from a living weapon to dead weight. She just lay there, her chest heaving, her eyes wide, staring up at him. He was still pinning her. His hands were still locked on her wrists. He looked at his own grip. His fingers were white, digging into her skin. He was holding her just as the slavers had. His strength, which had been a tool of restraint, now felt like a violation. Slowly, his grip loosened. His hands did not leave her. They shifted. His fingers uncurled from their desperate clamp. His hands, large and rough, moved, turning from fists of restraint into palms of support. His thumbs found the frantic, hammering pulse in her wrists. He felt the bird-like flutter of her life, fast and terrified. Beneath his touch, he was no longer holding her down. He was just holding her. He rolled off her, releasing her arms, and sat up, the cold sand seeping through his pants. He was shaking. She did not move for a long time. Then, slowly, she drew her knees up and pushed herself to a sitting position. She did not reach for the knife, which had fallen beside her. She just sat, hugging her good arm to her chest, breathing, a coward. She said, her voice was flat. Again. Rowan stood up. He walked back to the fire, his legs unsteady. He could not sit. He stood, his back to her, staring into the low, pulsing embers. He shoved his trembling hands into his pockets. He had to say it. He had opened the door, and now the ghosts were coming through. "I was a scout," he said. His voice was dead, flat as the salt pan. "Army, 3rd Cavalry. We were under orders from Major Evans. Ride to the high basin near the Cimarron." He stopped. He picked up a twig and tossed it into the fire. It flared, bright and quick. They called it a hostile encampment, said it was a raiding party. I led them there. I knew the high trail, the one that let us come in from above. Unseen. He turned, but he didn't see. She was just a shadow. Watching him. It was not a raiding party. It was a village, Paiute, mostly old men, women, children. He swallowed, his throat dry. 17. The word was a stone. It dropped into the cold silence and vanished. The order was to clear it. That was the word they used. Clear. The shooting started. He looked down at his own hands. I did not fire a shot. I sat on the ridge. On my horse I watched. I was the scout. My job was done. I just watched. He had watched the clearing. He had heard the sounds. He had waited until it was quiet. And then he had collected his pay and ridden north. Dasba was absolutely silent. She did not condemn him. She did not pity him. She did not offer him the easy escape of her anger or the cheap grace of her forgiveness. She was a mirror. She just reflected what he was. She let him see the thing he had confessed. He felt a sudden, desperate need to know what she was thinking. He could stand her hatred. He could not stand this cold, profound, measuring silence. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was not for him. It was for the night, for the fire. "You think I am your redemption?" The question was so precise, so clear, it cut him to the bone. He looked at her, truly saw her. The bandage, the raw ankles, the defiant spine. Was that what this was? Was he trying to wash the blood of 17 ghosts off his hands by saving one? He thought of the bolt cutters. He thought of the canteen. He thought of his hand on her wound. No, his voice was low, but certain. It was the first true thing he felt he had said all day. "I do not know what I think. I saw you, chained. I saw what they were." He looked up at the cold, uncaring stars. "I do not know what you are. You were just someone who needed help, and I happened to be there. This time, I could not just sit on the ridge." He sank to the ground, his back against a cold boulder, suddenly exhausted. He had said it. It was done. He waited for her to stand, to walk away into the dark. He knew, this time, he would not follow. She sat for a long time. The fire crackled. Then she moved. She stood up. She gathered her small blanket. Rowan tensed, watching her. She walked around the dying fire. She did not walk away. She walked toward him. She sat down on the same side of the fire, not touching, but close. The space between them was no longer 30 paces, or even 4 feet. It was the space of a single person. Her shoulder was a hand's breadth from his. She pulled her blanket around her, her gaze fixed on the embers. "When our warriors return," she said, her voice quiet, conversational. "They carry the marks of the fight. The man who was brave carries the scar from the arrow. The man who was wounded carries a limp." She turned her head, and her dark eyes found his in the flickering light. "The man who was a coward, he carries nothing. He is clean. He has no wounds. He is the most haunted." She looked back at the fire. "You carry the marks, but you carry them on the inside." She said nothing more. She wrapped the blanket tighter, leaned her head back against the rock, and closed her eyes. Rowan sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and for the first time in 3 years, he did not feel entirely alone. The confession settled into the cold. They did not sleep. They sat shoulder to shoulder against the granite, a shared bulwark against the past and the freezing dark. The fire died to a pulse of red embers, a sleeping eye in the vast blackness. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a shared space. Rowan was the first to hear it. It was not a sound. At first, it was a vibration, a tremor in the rock at his back, a deep, rhythmic disturbance, miles away, carried by the dense, cold earth. He put his hand flat on the granite. His head canted. Dasba was already looking at him. Her eyes, fixed on his, showed she felt it too. Then it came on the air. The faint, metallic chink of shod horses on stone. It was coming from the north, down through Hollow Step Canyon. Rowan was on his feet in one silent movement. His instinct, his training, took over. He kicked sand over the embers, plunging the camp into absolute, suffocating darkness. The tiny red eye was gone. "Who?" he whispered, his hand on his rifle, which he had kept across his lap. "3," she said. Her voice was flat. She was already on her feet, the bone knife in her hand. Or more. It could be Moxley's crew, having circled back, realizing their quarry was more than just a wounded woman. Or it could be her people, a search party. The uncertainty was a razor. A rescue party would see the tracks and call out. A hunting party would be silent. These riders were silent. "Moxley," Rowan said. The name a curse. They knew he was here. They knew he had the cutters. They were coming back for their property, and for the man who had interfered. "The horse," he said, turning. "No." Dasba's voice cut through the dark. "Too slow, too loud." She was right. Saddling the horse, riding out. They would be perfect targets against the pale sand in the faint moonlight. "This way." She grabbed his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong. She was not moving toward the open flats. She was moving deeper into the maze of stone, toward Red Butte Crossing. Rowan grabbed his saddlebags. He ripped them from the saddle, leaving the horse to its fate. He slung the heavy leather over one shoulder, his rifle in his other hand. He followed her shadow. She moved with a speed that belied her wound. She knew this ground. She flowed over the rocks, a part of the darkness. He was heavy, clumsy, his boots scraping, the saddlebags thumping against his hip. The hoofbeats were closer now, a steady, deliberate trot. They were not panicked. They were hunting. "Here!" Dasba stopped, vanishing. Rowan almost ran into the rock face. He stopped, panting, his breath a white plume. He saw her, a sliver of deeper black. She was pressing herself into a crack in the buttress, a fissure so narrow it looked like a geological flaw, not an opening. "In!" she commanded. She slid into the crack, turning sideways. Rowan followed. It was tighter than catclaw notch. It was a tomb. He pushed his saddlebags in first, shoving them down by his feet. Then he slid in, his back to the opening, his rifle held vertically against his chest. The rock walls were so close they touched him on both sides. He pressed back, and he met resistance. It was her. She was facing inward, her back to him. The crack was not deep enough for two people. He was pressed against her, his front to her back. He tried to brace himself, to avoid the contact. He put his hands up, flattening his palms against the rock walls on either side of her head. He locked his elbows, trying to create a few inches of space. It was useless. The fissure was too narrow. His chest was hard against her shoulders. His hips were flush against hers. He could feel the lean, hard muscle of her back, the heat of her body through the buckskin. He was breathing into her hair. It smelled of dust and wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of the linen bandage. The hoofbeats stopped, right outside. "This is the place." Moxley's voice, a low, gravelly rumble. "Fire's out, but the ground's warm. They were right here." Rowan felt Dasba's body go rigid. She started to turn her head, to look back. He reacted without thought. It was a purely tactical move, a gesture of absolute, necessary silence. He pressed his body forward, pinning her between himself and the rock. His right hand came off the wall and clamped, hard, over her mouth. His palm was rough, calloused, tasting of leather and salt. It covered her lips and jaw. He felt her hot, sharp intake of breath against his skin. Then nothing. She stilled. She understood. A horse snorted, the sound impossibly close, just feet from the crack. Rowan could smell the animal, the hot, dusty scent of its hide. A rider passed, a dark shape, a silhouette against the sliver of starry sky. The man was so close Rowan could have reached out and touched his stirrup. "Nothing," said Vreek's whining voice. "Tracks go into the rocks, both of me. He left the horse. He's smart." Quintero's voice, smoother, more dangerous. "But the woman's hurt. She's leaving blood. Not much, but enough. She can't go far." Rowan felt a tremor go through Dasba's body, a small, involuntary shiver. He kept his hand clamped over her mouth. He was breathing onto her neck, the side of her face. His own breath was shallow, silent. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears. He could feel her heart. It was a frantic, trapped bird rhythm, hammering against his chest. Or was it his? He could not tell. The two beats were one, a single, terrified pulse thrumming in the cold, dark space. The rock at his back was freezing, a sheet of ice. The body in front of him was a furnace. The silence was a physical thing. A knife held to their throats. "Spread out," Moxley commanded. "Find me. I want him." "I want her. Quintero, find that blood track, now!" The sound of saddle leather groaning. A long, stretching creak that sounded like a threat, like a rope taking a strain. The horses moved off. The sound of their hooves on the rock faded, then grew, then faded again. They were circling. They were in the maze with them. Rowan did not move. He kept his hand over her mouth. He kept his body pressed against hers. They were a single statue of terror, hidden in the stone. He could feel the frantic pulse in her throat, under his jaw. He could feel the slight, damp warmth of her breath on his palm. He did not know how long they stood there. It could have been minutes. It could have been an hour. The cold was seeping into his back, but his front was hot. Then, in the absolute, crushing stillness, she moved. It was impossible. There was no space to move. But she did. It was a slow, agonizing, internal slither. She did not push him away. She turned inside his arms. Her back slid along the rock wall, her shoulder turning, her hip scraping his. He had to ease the pressure of his body. Just an inch, to allow it. She turned, and she turned, until she was no longer facing the rock, but facing him. Now they were chest to chest. His hand was no longer over her mouth. It was braced on the rock wall just beside her head. His rifle was pinned between his body and hers. Her hands were trapped between them, pressed flat against his stomach. They were face to face in the dark, so close their foreheads were almost touching. He could not see her, only a faint gleam where her eyes should be. He could feel her breath, warm and quick, on his chin. She looked up at him. She spoke. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a breath, shaped into words. The same question she had asked by the fire, but it was not the same question. It was not about his past, his cowardice. It was about this rock, this moment. "Why are you still here?" He looked down into the darkness where her face was. He could smell the wound, the dried water from his canteen, the scent of her skin. He felt the frantic beat of her heart, not against his chest, but against his. He had no words. He had no confession. He had only this, "You know why." His voice was a thickened rasp. He felt her hand move. It slid up from his stomach, pushing between their bodies. He felt her fingers, light, trembling slightly from the cold or the fear, uncurl and spread flat over his heart. She was not pushing him away. She was not pulling him closer. She was holding him. She was checking the truth of his answer, not by his words, but by the frantic, pounding rhythm of his blood. They stood like that, frozen, carved from rock and shadow, for an eternity. Outside, far to the south, a shout. It was Moxley's roar. "There, a track, he's heading for the flats. He's running." The sound of horses, wheeling. The thunder of hooves, moving away. Fast. Toward the south, they were gone. They had found a false trail. Or Quintero had made a mistake. The sound faded. It was gone. There was nothing. Only the high, thin sound of the wind. Far above them. The silence that fell was not the silence of the knife edge. It was a new silence, heavy, thick, and irreversible. It was the silence of wet wool, absorbing all sound, all thought, all possibility of return. Her hand was still on his chest. His heart was still hammering under her palm. Neither of them moved. The hoofbeats were gone. The silence that rushed back into the fissure was absolute, a physical pressure. It was no longer the heavy, waiting silence of wet wool. It was the vast, empty silence of the desert at 3 a.m. They were alone. They remained locked in their vertical embrace. Rowan's heart was a hammer, a frantic, heavy thing against his own ribs, and he could feel her palm, flat and unmoving, pressed against his chest, absorbing every violent beat. His hand was still braced on the rock beside her head, his arm caging her in. His rifle was a hard, cold line of steel jammed between them. He should move. The rules of propriety, of decency, of the distance he had so carefully maintained, demanded he step back. The immediate threat was gone, but he did not move, and she did not move. Her hand, which had been a question, a truth meter, remained. The space did not reopen. They stayed for another breath, and another. The adrenaline that had spiked in terror now had nowhere to go. It drained away, leaving a different kind of tension, a low, thrumming hum that was deeper than the rock. She was the one who broke the stillness. Her fingers, which had been spread flat, testing his pulse, slowly curled. Then, with a lightness that belied the tension, one finger traced the rough linen seam of his shirt, a line running from his heart up toward his collarbone. It was not a caress. It was an inquiry, a single, silent question asked in the dark. He saw her eyes, 2 faint, luminous points in the pitch black, looking up at him. They were not asking, "Why are you here?" anymore. They were asking, "Who are you?" He knew the cost of this question. He knew the weight of the answer. He lowered his head, a slow, deliberate movement, a single nod. It was consent. Not just from him, but for both of them. An agreement spoken in the only language they had left. She met him halfway. She did not rise on her toes. She simply tilted her chin, closing the last impossible inch. The first kiss was a collision. It was not gentle. It was not soft. It was a brutal, desperate slamming together of 2 solitudes. It was the release of every second of the last 48 hours. It was the grit on their lips, the burn of the sun, the ice of the night, the terror of the hoofbeats. It was the taste of his confession and her silent absolution. It was intense, and it was raw. It tasted of salt, the dried sweat on their skin, and the faint, sweet memory of the water he had thrown her. It was a drowning. It was the first full breath he had taken since the Cimarron. His hand, the one braced against the rock, slid down. His fingers found the sharp, delicate line of her shoulder blade through the buckskin. His hand was huge, rough, and he held her as if she were a piece of spun glass. He supported. He did not pull. He held her. Her hand, the one on his chest, slid upward. Her fingers wove into the thick hair at the nape of his neck. Her grip was not soft. It was tight. She anchored herself to him, pulling him down, eliminating the last fraction of space, until there was no distance left to travel. They were not 2 people. They were a single, gasping entity in a crack in the world. The kiss broke. It had to, neither could breathe, but they did not pull apart. His forehead came to rest against hers. Her chin was tucked against his cheek. He could feel the fine, electric tremor in her body, the vibration of her wound, her exhaustion, her life. He breathed, and his breath was her breath. It was warm and damp against her skin. He felt her breathing in return, a shuddering, broken rhythm that matched his own. They stood like that, foreheads pressed together, eyes closed, supporting each other, the cold rock at his back, the cold rock at her back, and the impossible, searing heat between them. A whisper. It was his. Here. A breath. It was hers. Together. The words were not promises. They were facts. They were the only 2 facts in the universe. The strength left their legs at the same time. They did not fall. They slid. A slow, controlled collapse down the vertical wall of the fissure, their bodies scraping the sandstone. They landed in a heap on the soft, cold sand at the bottom. The embrace did not break, it transformed. He was sitting, his back against the rock. She was half in his lap, half beside him, drawn into the space between his legs, her back to his chest. His arms were around her. It was not the grip of the fight, nor the support of the kiss. It was a simple, encompassing hold. He pulled his heavy blanket from his shoulder, where it had been wedged, and shook it out with one arm. He draped it over both of them, a single, shared cocoon against the freezing dark. She leaned her head back against his shoulder. He felt the weight of her, total and trusting. He felt her body, which had been a rigid line of defense, finally go slack. The tension bled out of her, into him, into the sand. He rested his cheek on the top of her head. He could feel her heart, no longer frantic, but a deep, steady, slowing beat against his ribs. He could feel his own heart, matching its rhythm. The sound of their breathing, deep and even, filled the narrow space. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The confession was done. The truth was told. The debt was paid. The chain was not kindness. It was this shared animal warmth in the face of the void. The dawn came, not as a sound, but as a change in the quality of the darkness. A faint, gray light, thin as a silk scarf, began to leak through the narrow opening of the fissure, painting a pale line on the opposite wall. It was the first light of a new day. It found them asleep, not a deep sleep, but a shared, exhausted truce. His arms were locked around her. Her hands were resting on his chest. Their breathing was slow, their hearts calm. The closeness which had begun in terror and erupted in passion had settled into a profound, quiet warmth. The light touched her face. She stirred. He woke with her. For a moment, neither moved. They were simply warm. In the cold, gray light, the memory of the night was a physical presence. Then, the stiffness, the cold. Rowan felt the ache in his legs, the sharp pain in her body as she took a deeper breath. The bandage, the wound, the world returned. He loosened his arms. She did not pull away. She used his chest to steady herself, pushing up slightly. They unwound, not with haste, but with a slow, practical care. He stood first, his limbs aching. He reached down and offered her his hand. She looked at it, the hand that had cut her chains, the hand that had held her, the hand that had clamped over her mouth. She took it. He pulled her to her feet. She rose, and she was steady. They stood in the narrow fissure, face to face in the cold, morning light. They were covered in dust. His beard was matted. Her hair was a wild tangle. He looked at her. She looked at him. No one denied what had happened. There were no words of regret, no apologies, and neither of them called it a chain. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when the first sign appeared. It was a single, thin plume of dust, rising miles to the south, where the flats met the Mule Ear Basin. It was not the wind. It was too steady, too purposeful. Rowan, standing on a high boulder near the entrance to Red Butte Crossing, saw it. He did not need his field glasses. He knew. They had found the trail again. Moxley was a stubborn bastard. He had probably doubled back at dawn, found the place where they entered the rocks, and was now coming straight on. He slid down the rock face, landing softly in the sand next to Dasba. She was already on her feet, the bone knife in her hand. She had seen him watching. "They are coming," he said. She did not look south. She looked at the terrain around them. The maze of red sandstone, how many one dust trail. But it's wide. 3 riders, riding abreast. She nodded. It was a statement of fact. They were trapped. The maze was good for hiding. But if they were flushed out, they would be on foot against men on horseback in open country. Rowan looked at the cliffs above them. He knew this place, not as well as she did, maybe, but he knew it as a soldier knows a battlefield. "We cannot outrun them," he said. "Not on foot. Then we stop them." Her voice was cold, flat. Rowan pointed north, toward a narrow, shadowed cleft in the rock face, half a mile away. Whippoorwill slot. You know it? She looked, a flicker of recognition. The choke point. The walls are unstable. Exactly. The rain last season undercut the east wall. It's hanging by a thread. A good shout could bring it down. She understood instantly. It was not a defensive position. It was a trap. They moved. They did not run. Running left panicked tracks. They walked with a deliberate, heavy tread, making sure their footprints were visible in the soft sand. They were laying a trail of breadcrumbs. At the entrance to Whippoorwill Slot, Dasba stopped. She reached into her pouch. She pulled out the piece of blood-soaked buckskin Rowan had cut from her tunic the day before. It was stiff, black with dried blood. She dropped it in the center of the trail, right where the sand turned to hardpan. It was a scream in the silence, a perfectly placed piece of bait. Rowan climbed. He scrambled up the broken rock face on the west side of the slot, finding a perch 20 feet up, hidden behind a slab of fallen sandstone. He had a clear view of the slot's entrance and the hanging wall opposite him. Dasba did not climb. She walked into the slot. She went 50 yards in, past the danger zone, and found a niche in the rock. She took her long, braided rawhide rope, the one she had used to bind her own hair, and tied one end to a precarious stack of 3 heavy stones that acted as a chockstone for the unstable cliff face. She held the other end. She was the trigger. They waited. The dust plume grew. The sound of hooves reached them, echoing off the canyon walls. They were riding hard now, smelling the end of the hunt. Moxley's voice bellowed, echoing weirdly in the confined space. Blood here, fresh blood. They're hurt bad. That was Vreek, his voice high and excited. Careful, Quintero's smooth voice cut in. It's too easy. But blood fever had them. They kicked their horses into a gallop. They hit the entrance to the slot. Pardo Quintero was in the lead, his dark face intense, eyes scanning the ground. Tomer Vreek was right behind him, leaning forward in the saddle. Judd Moxley, the big man, was bringing up the rear, his shotgun across his thighs. They saw the bloodied buckskin. They saw the clear tracks leading into the narrow, dark defile. Got me, Moxley roared. Get in there, flush me out. They thundered into the slot. The walls magnified the sound of the hooves to a deafening roar. Rowan, high above, watched them enter the kill zone. He waited. He let Quintero pass. He let Vreek pass. He waited until Moxley was right under the hanging wall. Now, he didn't shout. He didn't signal. He saw Dasba, 50 yards down the canyon. Brace herself. She didn't just pull the rope. She threw her whole body weight backward, yanking the chockstone free with a desperate, violent jerk. The keystone popped out. For a split second, nothing happened. The cliff face hung there, defying gravity. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the center of the earth, the entire east wall of the slot detached itself. It didn't fall like rocks. It fell like a curtain. Hundreds of tons of red sandstone sheared off in a single, massive sheet. Rowan raised his rifle. He didn't aim at the men. He aimed at the ground right in front of Quintero's lead horse. Blam! The shot was deafening in the confined space. Quintero's horse, already spooked by the groaning rock, reared violently. Screaming, it bucked, twisting in the narrow space, blocking Vreek. Then the wall hit. The sound was beyond deafening. It was a physical blow that knocked the wind out of Rowan's lungs. The world disappeared in a cloud of choking red dust. He heard horses screaming. He heard men shouting, their voices instantly cut off. When the roar subsided to a rumble of settling rocks, the dust began to clear. The Whippoorwill Slot was gone. It was a solid wall of fallen rock. Tomer Vreek was gone, buried under 20 feet of sandstone. Pardo Quintero had been thrown clear by his rearing horse just as the rock fell. He was on the ground, dazed, covered in dust, scrambling backward on his hands and knees away from the rock slide. His horse was down, half buried, thrashing. Judd Moxley was alive. He had been just at the edge of the fall. His horse had been struck by falling debris and gone down, pinning his leg for a moment before scrambling up. Moxley was on his feet, limping heavily, his face a mask of blood and dust. He still held the shotgun. He looked up at the cloud of dust where the cliff had been. He couldn't see Rowan. He couldn't see Dasba. "Rusk," he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage and shock. He fired both barrels of the shotgun blindly into the dust cloud. Boom, boom. The shot pattered harmlessly against the rocks. "Deputy Rusk, get in here, we got me trapped." Rusk Rowan, from his perch, could see out onto the flats beyond the slot's entrance. He saw a fourth rider, a man in a tan duster, sitting on a big bay horse, holding back. Deputy Abel Rusk, the man who took Moxley's money to look the other way. Rusk heard the roar of the landslide. He heard Moxley's panicked, desperate shouts. He saw the cloud of dust rising like a tombstone. Rowan jacked a fresh cartridge into his rifle. He had a clear shot at Moxley. He could end it right now. The man was wounded, disoriented. It would be easy. He lowered the rifle. No, he was not an executioner. He had stopped them. Freak was dead by his own greed. Quintero was broken. Moxley was finished. He looked out at Rusk. The deputy was smart. He heard Moxley calling his name, tying him to this disaster. He saw the dust. He made his choice. He wheeled his horse and kicked it into a gallop, heading south, away from the wreck, away from the questions that would follow. Rowan watched him go. Let him run. Let him carry the story of what happened here. He slid down the backside of his perch, landing in the soft sand of a side gully. Dasba was there. She had already doubled back through a narrow fissure. She was covered in red dust, looking like a spirit risen from the earth. She didn't ask if they were dead. She knew. She had felt the ground shake. They didn't speak. They turned and ran, slipping through the narrow, winding cracks of Red Butte Crossing, leaving the wall of dust and death behind them. It was a curtain falling on the first act of their lives. They walked for 3 hours. The red dust from the rockfall had long since settled. The echoes had died. The only sound was the scuff of their boots on the gravel and the high, thin cry of a hawk, far overhead. The sun climbed, but it had lost its teeth. The terror was gone. What was left was a vast, hollow exhaustion and the new, strange, solid reality of what had passed between them in the dark. They had found Rowan's horse. It was grazing a mile from Red Butte, having broken its reins. It came to him, its eyes wide, nostrils flared, still spooked by the thunder of the rockfall. Now, he walked, leading the horse. Dasba walked beside him. Not 30 paces, not 4 feet, just beside him. They moved as a unit, 2 weary travelers on a single road. By noon, they reached the edge of the painted mesa. It was a line, not a line on a map, but a line in the earth. Behind them was the alkali, the fractured canyons, the badlands. Ahead was a high, wind-swept plateau, covered in dry, pale grass that rippled in the wind. The air was different here, clearer, with the sharp, clean scent of cedar and pine from a higher elevation. Her land, behind them, his life, the settlements, San Miguel, the army, the ghosts. They stopped. There was no discussion. It was simply the end of the road. Rowan turned, his hand on the horse's neck. He looked at her. The new bandage he had applied that morning was clean. The color had returned to her face. She was still wounded, still exhausted. But she was no longer dying. She was home, and he was not. The space between them felt enormous. An emptiness he had not known was there. The thought of turning, of riding south alone, was a physical weight, a cold sickness in his gut. The silence he had shared with her, the silence of the fire. The silence of the fissure was preferable to the silence he was returning to. The words slipped out. He had not meant to say them. They were a selfish, desperate lunge. "I could follow," he said, his voice too rough. "I could keep my distance. Make sure you get to your people." She had been looking out over the mesa, her eyes full of the high, empty spaces. She turned her head, slowly. Her gaze was not angry. It was not disappointed. It was clear, sharp, and absolutely final. "A shadow is also a chain." The words struck him, Not with the venom of her first refusal, but with the cold, pure weight of truth. He saw it. He finally, completely, understood. From the moment he'd put the bolt cutters to the iron, he had been trying to free himself. He had been looking for a way out. He had seen her as a token, a chance, a path to redemption. He had needed her to need him, so he could wash his hands of the 17 ghosts at the Cimarron. He had not been trying to find her way home. He had been desperately trying to find his own. His kindness was a chain. His protection was a cage. His love, if that was what the terrible, aching thing in his chest was just another way of saying mine, a shadow, a thing that follows, that latches on, that cannot be shaken, that proves you are not truly alone. He looked down at his boots, at the dust. The shame was so profound it was like a physical illness. "You are right," he whispered. They stood there. The wind moved her hair, blowing a dark strand across her face. They were as close as they had been in the dark, chest to chest. But this time, there was a universe between them. She reached out, not to touch him. She just lifted her hand and gently brushed the strand of hair from her own eyes. He looked up. Her eyes were not black in the bright sun. They were a deep, clear brown, shot through with flecks of amber, like sunlight trapped in stone. They were seeing him, not the soldier, not the savior, not the lover, just him. "You are learning," she said, and her voice was quiet. "It is not too late." He felt the words as a kind of grace, not forgiveness, just an acknowledgement. He did not know what to do. He could not just turn and ride away. He could not stay. He was frozen on the line between his world and hers. She stepped closer. She put her hand on his chest, where it had been the night before. This time, there was no terror. His heart was a slow, heavy, aching drum. She could feel it. She rose on her toes. The second kiss was nothing like the first. It was short. It was precise. It was dry and warm as the wind. It was her lips, chapped but soft, brushing his. It was a final, deliberate press. It was not a collision of needs. It was a statement of fact. It was an ending. He just received it. He smelled the dry, clean scent of cedar in her hair, the smell of the high plateau. It was full of goodbye, and it was full of thank you. She stepped back. The space was open again, but it was not empty. "I will tell my people the truth," she said, her voice clear and formal, as if sealing the moment. He nodded, unable to speak. "I will tell them I was taken. I will tell them I fought. I will tell them I freed myself." He met her gaze. "That is the truth. And I will tell them," she continued, her amber eyes holding his, "that a foolish, haunted cowboy helped me live." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I can live with that." He turned to his horse. He put his foot in the stirrup, his hand on the pommel. He stopped. "I will ride another way," he said, looking not at her, but south toward San Miguel. "I will not ride back through the basin. A wise man." She said. He swung his leg over the saddle. He sat, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked down at her. She was small against the vastness of the mesa. She was a single, strong, unbroken line. There was nothing left to say. He reined the horse, turning its head south. He did not say goodbye. He heard her move. He did not look back. He kicked the horse, and it moved into a walk, then a trot, carrying him away from the line, back into the world that was his. He rode for a mile before he stopped. He turned in the saddle. She was gone. He looked for her, a small figure in the pale grass. But there was nothing. Then he saw her. She was far away, halfway to the horizon. She was not a small figure. She was a part of the landscape, a steady, moving shape that belonged to the wind and the high, open sky. She was walking. She had not looked back, not once. Each step was a single, perfect stitch, closing the wound in the world behind her. Rowan Decker crossed the Red Willow Ford 3 days later. He stopped his horse in the middle of the shallow water, letting the animal drink. The current was clear, washing the red dust from its hooves. He dismounted. He walked to an old, sun-bleached cottonwood stump that stood on the far bank like a grave marker. He reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out the heavy iron bolt cutters. He looked at them. They were just tools, cold, heavy, indifferent. But to him, they felt like a badge he had worn, a false star he had pinned to his own chest. He had thought they were the key to freedom. Now he knew they were just another way to say, I have the power. He placed them on the flat top of the stump. He left them there, a monument to a man he no longer was. He mounted and rode south. He did not look back. He reached San Miguel Station late in the evening. He did not go to the saloon. He went straight to the federal marshal's office. He told the marshal everything. He gave the names Judd Moxley, Tomer Vreek, Pardo Quintero. He described the place where Vreek was buried under the rock. He described Quintero, broken and running. He described Moxley, wounded and desperate. And then he gave the last name, Deputy Abel Rusk, the marshal. A tired man with eyes that had seen too much. Wrote it all down. He did not ask why Rowan had been there. He just nodded. The telegraph wires began to hum. The story traveled faster than any horse. Within a week, it was news in Tucson. In Santa Fe, Pardo Quintero was arrested trying to cross the border at Las Nieves, broken and half-starved. Moxley vanished. A ghost story told around campfires. A warning to men who thought the desert had no eyes. Abel Rusk was stripped of his badge in absentia. A wanted man. Rowan heard the news, and he felt nothing but a quiet, grim satisfaction. It was not vengeance. It was just cleaning up the mess. Far to the north, Dasba walked into the Canones del Venado. She was alone when she entered the canyon, but she was not alone for long. High on the rimrock, silhouettes appeared against the sky. They did not shout. They did not wave. They just watched her come. They were her people. They had been searching. When she reached the camp, there was no great fanfare. There were quiet greetings, hands touching her arms, eyes checking her wounds. They saw the gash, healing clean. They saw the raw scars on her wrists and ankles. That night, by the fire, she sat with the elders. She told them the story. She told them of the chains, of the 3 men, of the fight. She told them of the rockfall, and she told them of the white man. She did not call him a savior. She called him a man who was lost, who had helped her find her way, and in doing so, perhaps found a little of his own. She took a thin strip of rawhide. She did not ask anyone to tie it for her. She tied it herself, around her left wrist, just above the scar from the manacle. It was not a chain. It was a reminder that she had been bound, and that she had chosen to be free. Years passed. Rowan Decker never went back to the Painted Mesa. He worked the southern ranges, a quiet man who was good with horses and kept to himself. He never married. One night, camped on the Ghost Saguaro Plain. A cold north wind blew down from the high country. It carried the scent of cedar and pine, a scent that always made him stop whatever he was doing. He sat by his fire, listening to the wind. And in the wind, he thought he heard something. It was faint, so faint it might have been a trick of the firelight and the lonely dark. It sounded like laughter, not the rough laughter of men in a saloon. It was the high, clear, untroubled laughter of children. It was not his children. He knew that, but it was enough to know that somewhere, far to the north, life was continuing, that the line had not been broken. He understood then, finally and completely, what she had taught him. The greatest love is not to hold on. It is not to save. It is to have the strength to withdraw your hand when the time is right, to let the other person walk their own path, even if it leads away from you, to stand alone in your own silence, knowing you did the right thing, not for thanks, not for redemption, but because it was, simply, the right thing. They never met again. She walked her path on the high mesa, a woman who carried a scar and a story. He walked his path on the low deserts, a man who had left his chains on a cottonwood stump, and the heaviest chain of all, the one that had bound his heart, the desperate need to be the hero, to be the savior, was gone. He was just a man, and that, he found, was enough. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from today, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Rowan and Dasba's journey. And if you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like the video, and hit that hype button so more people can hear it.